Daniel Harper learned how quickly an ordinary morning could turn into something life-changing. One moment, his wife Emma was laughing softly while pouring coffee in their Chicago kitchen. And the next, she collapsed without warning. The sound of the cup breaking against the floor stayed in his mind long after the ambulance doors closed. At the hospital, doctors spoke carefully, explaining that Emma's body had been pushed too far by stress and exhaustion. She would recover, but not quickly. She needed rest, monitoring, and time. More time than Daniel knew how to handle alone. When Emma's mother, Margaret Collins, arrived that same evening with calm eyes and steady confidence, Daniel felt relief he didn't question. She hugged him briefly, asked practical questions, and immediately began organizing everything the hospital staff mentioned. While Daniel sat beside Emma's bed feeling helpless, Margaret handled paperwork, spoke with nurses, and made sure nothing was forgotten. It felt natural to let her take control because someone had to stay strong, and Daniel didn't feel strong at all. Within days, Margaret moved into Daniel and Emma's home to help, while Emma remained hospitalized. At first, Daniel appreciated every small thing she did. The house stayed clean, meals appeared on the table without effort, and bills were sorted neatly in folders. After long days at work, followed by emotional hospital visits, Daniel returned home to warm food and quiet conversation instead of an empty house. Margaret never acted demanding. She spoke gently and respectfully, often reminding him to rest. She seemed to understand grief and worry in a way Daniel could not explain. Slowly, the home began running smoothly again, but it also began feeling different. Emma's presence remained in photographs and decorations, yet her absence filled every room. Margaret tried to preserve Emma's routines, lighting her favorite candles, folding blankets the same way, playing soft music in the evenings, but instead of comfort, Daniel sometimes felt a strange sense that life was continuing without Emma. Daniel's daily routine became predictable. He worked long hours, visited Emma at the hospital, then returned home late at night. Emma's recovery was slow, and conversations with her were often brief because she tired easily. She tried to stay positive, but frustration showed through her smiles. She hated depending on others and worried about being away from home for so long. Daniel reassured her constantly, promising everything would return to normal soon, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. When visits ended and he walked through the hospital parking lot alone, loneliness followed him like a shadow. At home, Margaret often waited in the kitchen with tea or dinner, asking how Emma was doing. Their conversations started simply, focused on updates and responsibilities, but gradually they expanded into stories about work, childhood memories, and ordinary life. Talking with her felt easy because she listened carefully, without judging or interrupting. One evening during a heavy rainstorm, the power went out briefly, leaving the house lit only by candlelight. Daniel and Margaret sat in silence at first, listening to rain hitting the windows. Without phones or television, conversation came naturally. Margaret spoke about Emma as a child, stubborn yet kind, determined even when she was small. Daniel laughed genuinely, realizing he had not laughed in weeks. For a moment, the stress surrounding him faded. He felt calm, and that calm unsettled him because he believed he should feel worried every second while Emma was still in the hospital. Margaret noticed his tension and gently told him that caring for someone also meant allowing himself moments of rest. Her words were simple, but they reached him deeply. Daniel began recognizing how much he relied on her presence to keep his emotions steady. As days passed, Margaret sometimes joined him during hospital visits. Nurses appreciated her organized questions, and doctors explained medical details more clearly when she was present. Daniel found comfort standing beside someone who understood what to ask when his own thoughts felt scattered. Emma seemed happy to see her mother, yet Daniel occasionally noticed a quiet sadness in Emma's eyes when visits ended, and she watched them leave together. He dismissed the feeling quickly, convincing himself it was only exhaustion. After all, Margaret was helping everyone, so was nothing wrong with support during a difficult time. Still, Daniel felt an invisible shift he could not fully explain. At home, conversations with Margaret became the most relaxed part of his day. While hospital visits felt heavier and filled with uncertainty, one night after visiting hours ended, early Daniel and Margaret stopped at a small cafe near the hospital because neither wanted to go home immediately. Snow fell softly outside the windows, covering the streets in silence. They talked about Emma again, but soon the conversation turned toward their own lives. Margaret shared stories about her past marriage, explaining how loneliness can exist, even when people try their best to hold a family together. Daniel listened closely, realizing he had never seen her as a person beyond being Emma's mother. She spoke honestly about mistakes, regrets, and learning to move forward without bitterness. Daniel found himself opening up too, admitting fears. He had not shared with anyone his worry about losing Emma emotionally, even if she recovered physically, and his struggle to stay hopeful. The conversation felt comforting, yet afterward Daniel sensed something delicate had changed between them. Nothing inappropriate had happened, but emotional distance had quietly shortened. Returning home that night, Daniel noticed how carefully Margaret had maintained the house. Emma's side of the bed was neatly arranged, pillows perfectly placed as if waiting for her return. Instead of comfort, the sight filled Daniel with guilt. The home no longer felt paused in Emma's absence. It felt adapted. He sat on the edge of the bed, wondering when adjustment had replaced waiting. Downstairs, he heard Margaret moving quietly in the kitchen, preparing things for the next day. The normal sounds of living continued, and Daniel suddenly questioned whether he had allowed life to move forward too easily without Emma beside him. He grabbed his coat impulsively, thinking he should return to the hospital even though visiting hours were over, just to prove his loyalty to himself. Before he reached the door, Margaret appeared in the hallway and gently told him he needed rest. She briefly touched his arm in reassurance, a simple, caring gesture, yet Daniel felt strangely aware of it long afterward. That night's sleep refused to come. Daniel stared at the ceiling, replaying recent weeks in his mind. He realized he had begun depending on Margaret emotionally, not intentionally, but gradually. She filled silence, eased stress, and provided understanding during moments when he felt weakest. The realization frightened him because he loved Emma deeply and never imagined emotional boundaries could blur without clear intention. He told himself nothing was wrong, yet doubt remained. Early the next morning, Emma called from the hospital. Her voice sounded fragile but thoughtful. After a short conversation about recovery, she hesitated before asking a question that caught Daniel off guard. She asked whether he still felt close to her despite the distance created by illness and time apart. Daniel opened his mouth to answer immediately, but uncertainty slowed him for just a moment. That brief hesitation lasted only a second, yet it felt heavy enough to change everything. Emma noticed the pause even though he quickly reassured her, and the conversation ended more quietly than usual after the call. Daniel sat alone holding his phone, realizing that emotional changes often happen silently, without clear decisions or dramatic events. Nothing improper had occurred, yet he sensed a line he needed to understand before crossing it unknowingly. The house around him felt calm, organized, and safe, but inside confusion began growing. For the first time since Emma's hospitalization, Daniel wondered whether loneliness could reshape relationships in ways people never expect. And as he prepared for another long day, he understood that the hardest part of Emma's recovery might not be physical healing at all, but protecting the emotional bond they once believed could never weaken. The hesitation during Emma's phone call stayed in Daniel Harper's mind long after he hung up. He tried to focus on work, but numbers blurred on his computer screen. Kima had asked a simple question, whether he still felt close to her. Yet his delayed answer revealed something he didn't want to face. He loved his wife deeply, but weeks of distance, worry, and routine had quietly changed how he moved through his days. That realization filled him with guilt. When he returned home that evening, Margaret Collins noticed his silence immediately. She had become skilled at reading emotions without words. She asked if Emma was improving, and Daniel nodded, giving short answers while avoiding longer conversation. For the first time since she moved in, he felt unsure how to act around her. The comfort he once felt now carried confusion. Dinner passed quietly. Margaret spoke gently about Emma's upcoming treatment schedule, but Daniel's thoughts drifted elsewhere. He began recognizing how naturally their lives had blended during Emma's absence. They shared meals, discussed daily plans, and supported each other emotionally. None of it had crossed clear boundaries, yet emotional closeness had grown without intention. Daniel realized he needed distance, not because Margaret had done anything wrong, but because he feared losing focus on his marriage. Over the next few days, he changed his routine. He stayed longer at the office, spent extra hours at the hospital even when Emma slept, and limited conversations at home to practical topics. Margaret sensed the shift but respected it. She understood that healing sometimes required stepping back. Emma's conditions slowly improved, and after nearly 2 months, doctors announced she could finally return home. Daniel felt relief mixed with nervous energy. He cleaned the house carefully, wanting everything to feel welcoming. Margaret added flowers near the entrance and prepared Emma's favorite meals. When Emma walked through the front door, supported gently by Daniel, emotion filled the room. She smiled, grateful yet exhausted. The house looked peaceful, almost staged, and Emma noticed immediately. She thanked her mother warmly, but looked around with quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand how life had continued without her presence. Recovery at home proved challenging. Emma moved slowly and depended on help for simple tasks. Daniel tried his best, but he sometimes felt like a guest in routines Margaret had managed for weeks. Margaret handled medications, meals, and schedules effortlessly, while Daniel struggled to find his place again. Emma observed everything carefully. She watched how easily Daniel and Margaret communicated in the kitchen, how they anticipated each other's needs without speaking. Nothing inappropriate happened, yet Emma sensed a closeness formed during her absence. She never accused or complained. Instead, she grew quieter, processing emotions privately while focusing on regaining strength. Daniel noticed her silence and worried he had somehow failed her, though he couldn't explain how. One evening, Emma gently thanked her mother for all the help but suggested that she and Daniel needed time alone to rebuild their routine. Margaret understood immediately. She realized her presence, once necessary, might now prevent healing. That night, she packed her suitcase without drama. When Daniel saw her preparing to leave, he felt surprised and uneasy. He insisted she could stay longer, but Margaret smiled kindly and explained that her role was to support, not replace. She spoke calmly, telling him that difficult situations often bring people closer because they share responsibility and loneliness. But true loyalty is shown by the choices made afterward. Her words struck Daniel deeply. At the door, they shared a brief, respectful goodbye filled with gratitude rather than emotion. As Margaret drove away, Daniel felt both relief and emptiness. The house suddenly became quieter, forcing him and Emma to face each other without distraction. The first days alone together felt awkward. Daniel and Emma moved carefully around one another, unsure how to reconnect after weeks of separation. Conversations started slowly, focused on daily updates and recovery progress, without Margaret organizing everything. Daniel learned again how to care for Emma directly, preparing meals, managing medication times, and sitting beside her during long afternoons. Mistakes happened, and they sometimes laughed at small misunderstandings. Gradually, shared responsibility rebuilt intimacy. One evening, while watching television together, Emma asked gently whether something had changed while she was hospitalized. Her voice held curiosity rather than accusation, which made honesty possible. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. He admitted that he had felt overwhelmed and emotionally weak during her absence. Margaret's presence had given him stability, and he had depended on that comfort more than he realized. He explained that nothing romantic had happened, but emotional reliance had grown in ways that frightened him once he recognized it. Emma listened quietly, absorbing every word. After a long silence, she asked whether he had fallen in love with her mother. Daniel answered honestly that he had not, but he admitted he came close to confusing comfort with connection. Saying the truth aloud lifted a weight he had carried silently. Emma's eyes filled with tears, yet she appreciated his honesty more than perfection. Their conversation became a turning point. Instead of creating distance, it opened space for understanding. Emma confessed that illness had made her feel powerless and afraid of being forgotten. Hearing Daniel's vulnerability reassured her that their bond still mattered. They agreed that relationships require attention even during hardship, and emotional distance can grow quietly if left unspoken. From that night forward, they worked intentionally to reconnect. They cooked meals together slowly, shared evening walks when Emma regained strength, and talked openly about fears they once avoided. Healing became emotional as much as physical. Weeks passed and Emma improved steadily. The house regained its natural rhythm, shaped by both of them rather than outside help. Daniel noticed small details he had overlooked before: Emma's laughter returning, her habit of humming while organizing shelves, the warmth she brought simply by being present. Gratitude replaced guilt. He learned that loyalty is not proven by never struggling, but by recognizing mistakes before they grow into actions that cannot be undone. Occasionally, Margaret visited for dinner. The atmosphere remained warm but balanced. Boundaries existed naturally now, built on awareness rather than tension. Margaret treated Daniel with respectful distance, proud that her daughter's marriage had strengthened instead of weakened. One evening months later, Daniel watched Emma standing in the kitchen sunlight, healthy again and smiling as she prepared coffee. Just like the morning before, everything changed. The memory of fear and confusion felt distant, yet meaningful. You realize that infidelity is not always a dramatic event. Sometimes it begins quietly through emotional absence, loneliness, and unrecognized needs. What mattered most was choosing honesty before crossing a line that could break trust permanently. Daniel walked over and wrapped his arms gently around Emma from behind. She leaned into him naturally, comfortable and secure. In that simple moment, he understood that love survives not because it avoids challenges, but because people choose each other again after facing them. Life moved forward with renewed clarity. Daniel became more present. Emma valued open communication, and their marriage felt deeper than before the crisis. The experience taught them that vulnerability can either divide people or bring them closer depending on how truth is handled. As evening settled over their home, Daniel felt peace for the first time since the hospital days. The silence no longer felt heavy, it felt shared. Emma smiled at him across the room, and he knew that while hardship had tested their bond, it had also revealed its strength. They had faced uncertainty, emotional confusion, and quiet temptation. Yet they returned to one another with greater understanding. And in choosing honesty over secrecy, they protected the love that had nearly been lost without ever truly breaking.